I got really interested in negotiation when I was working in management consulting at McKinsey. Being a professor was not part of my life plan. It wasn't something I had thought about. But for reasons I won't totally go into now, just because of time, when I was in consulting, I started to really understand the importance of negotiation for a variety of different things. One, it was something I was actually called on to do quite a bit on behalf of our clients who themselves found negotiation uncomfortable with vendors and suppliers and wanted us to take on that role. I saw it being really critical to being able to manage the consultant-client relationship, to get somebody's willing cooperation and partnership with you when they really didn't have to do it. And I also saw it as really important for being able to advocate for your own career. But I didn't feel particularly skilled in it, and I wanted to understand it better. And it was actually my interest in negotiation that even drove me to graduate school to begin with. I was passionate about it. And I now, because of my role, do teach on a variety of things related to leadership and human behavior. But my negotiation is what got me here. It's the thing I talk about the most and that I am really passionate about. So I'm excited to get to do that here. Now, I come to Kenan-Flagler, I've been here a while. I do this a lot of days, and I do it because I like it, because for me, it's all the cool stuff about psychology that I really like to talk about without none of the bad stuff about being a professor. So people who reference being in my class, they had to deal with things like a syllabus and an assignment, and they had to write it, and I had to grade it, and I had to comment on it, and they had to think maybe she probably should have given me a better grade. And all of those things that happen, we don't have to have here. What we have is just time to talk about whatever is interesting and relevant to you. I have come prepared with things to say, but I don't particularly have an agenda or a part that I need to get to by a certain point of time. And what that means is that this is your time to use to get out of it whatever you want, including asking me, and hopefully asking me and even others questions. So from a science perspective, right, there is a lot of doom and gloom when it comes to women and negotiation as a topic. So what we know is that women are disadvantaged at essentially every single stage of the negotiation process. So we start with what I'd call pre-negotiation. I'm not even there in the negotiation yet. There's a decision to be made, and that is, should I even do it? And the research here basically says that one of the biggest problems we have is before we even get to the conversation. So cool data that ended up being sort of a subject of a book that I'll recommend to you, and you may have already read. Carnegie Mellon, several years ago, they document in their graduate business program a wage gap that we see all the time between men and women, where the male students upon graduation are getting paid more than the female students, even after controlling for all the things that could make that wage gap legitimate. And they see this persistent gap. And they do something that no one has really done before, and that is they start to ask the students about their negotiating behavior. And when they do, they find that a majority of the men, no, not all, it was 57% of the men in that study, attempted, when they got an offer from a company, attempted to negotiate on at least one element of it. Only 7% of the women even tried, okay? The other 93% took the offer that they were given. And that difference in behavior, the willingness to even ask, led to essentially the wage gap that they were seeing. So that led those researchers to write a book, which is a good book, and it's called Women Don't Ask: Negotiation and the Gender Divide. So basically saying from the very beginning, women are much less likely to approach a negotiation that is about their self-interest than are men. So that's step one. Second step in a negotiation process is I'm going to negotiate, now I have to prepare for it, now I have to plan for it. What do I want? What is my goal? What am I trying to set my sights on? In negotiation, we'll call that an aspiration. What am I trying to achieve? Women set lower aspirations, right? What's the least I'm going to take? Women are willing to take less. And the basic finding there is the idea of negotiation makes women anxious in general. I'm talking about averages. And when people are anxious, these are the things that start to happen. They start to ratchet down their expectations. So we see that happen with women on average in comparison to men at the planning stage. Then we get to a conversation, and now we have to propose something. Women make less ambitious first offers. They are more quickly to concede and counteroffer. And then you get to a final stage of, when is this thing over? Okay, when do we say, I've got what I need, enough is enough, I'm actually going to say thank you and move on. And women are quicker to exit negotiations and ultimately have deals that are worse than those of their male counterparts. When two women negotiate together, they are much less likely to create value than when two men negotiate together. Again, partly due to these concerns. So every single stage, from a research perspective, we see women being outperformed by men. And the consequences of that are also well documented, and to me, personally upsetting, and upsetting on behalf of all of us. So we know that women face consistent, persistent economic disadvantage. So every statistic you look at, it doesn't matter which one, men will get paid more than women for the same work. That starts to trickle down in a lot of different ways. Retirement savings, right? Men's retirement savings dwarf those of women's, and it all has to do with compensation, right? If retirement is based on what you earn throughout your career. So if someone earns more than you, the statistics that I've seen are women's retirement savings are on average half of men. Now, not all of that is due to negotiation behavior, but some of it is. And organizations know this. So the organizational expectations, men expect to be paid more than women, and organizations know it. They think if they're gonna hire a man, they think they have to offer more than if they're gonna hire a woman. Now, this is a really important point that I want you to make, because everything I've said so far is about pay, money, money, money. Negotiation is not a skill set that is limited to buying houses, cars, and negotiating your salary, okay? Negotiation is actually a relationship management skill set. It is a skill set where we try to achieve goals and where we need other people's cooperation to make those goals happen. Most of the negotiations that we are involved in are not about pay, they're not about money, and they don't even occur across a formal bargaining table. Most of the time you're at work, you're trying to get somebody else to do something, or someone else is trying to get you to do it in exchange. Those are negotiations. So when our reluctance to initiate negotiations on our own behalf, on our own self-interest, doesn't just affect economic outcomes, it also just makes our ability to get what we want out of our relationships less effective. To be able to say, I do the work I want, I do it when I want, I have some autonomy in my own life. So it's really important to me when you think about negotiation skills and negotiations that you don't just think about the ones that involve money, because most of the things we do actually aren't in that category. And so by disadvantaging ourselves, we're making a lot of things worse. Now, let's talk about the why, okay? Why are women reluctant to negotiate? Why all those things that I said about every single stage, right? Why? We're taught to be nice. Exactly. Exactly. Okay. And so psychology has documented this too. So if we talk about it in really psychology-ish terms, okay, we're going to call it a stereotype conflict. Okay, stereotype is nothing more, as you know, than a set of expectations about how members of a particular group do behave and should behave. And for women, what researchers have documented is that when it comes to negotiation, there is a stereotype conflict, because we have a mental model of what a good negotiator is. A good negotiator is assertive and demanding and ambitious and independent, okay? And if you're a man, there's nothing about that stereotype that is inconsistent with how a good man is supposed to behave. But if you are a woman, a conflict emerges, because to be those things that I've said that we think a good negotiator should be, those are at odds with a woman should be other-oriented and nurturing and caring and selfless, okay? So it creates this conflict. And this idea that to do those things, to negotiate, is going to make me less liked. It's going to make me be seen as bitchy. It's not ladylike to do those things. And that's essentially the fear that people have. And psychologists have been able to kind of essentially document this and show this. And so here's where the news actually gets worse. They're absolutely right? So they document this too, okay? It's called social backlash. That when women are advocates for their own self-interest, people do see them as more demanding and do see them as less nice than when men do the exact same thing. Now, okay, damned if you do, damned if you don't. If you are now not negotiating for your own benefit, but there's a negotiation to benefit somebody else, a subordinate, your child, another person, okay? If you don't negotiate as a woman to benefit someone else, now you're seen as cold and heartless, because you're supposed to be a good advocate for other people. You're just not supposed to do it for yourself. It's not just men who think this. So in all the research studies, they find that women and men penalize women to the same rate, and that nobody does it consciously. Okay, nobody says, I am upset with that person because women should not negotiate. These are non-conscious biases in the same way we carry all kinds of other non-conscious biases. So the backlash is real. My first piece of advice to you is going to say, let's eliminate the word negotiate from our vocabulary. And when you turn the word negotiate into the word ask, gender effect completely goes away. Okay? Now, that's semantics. Like substantively, there's absolutely no difference in the behavior. But ask is a submissive, ladylike thing to do, right? There's nothing wrong with asking. So you start to use the word ask, it changes people's perception about what's actually occurring. I'm fine to ask, that's fine, just the negotiating thing I don't like, so then I'll ask for more money. Gender effect completely goes away. So one of the things I think is hardest is to get people to overcome the associations that they have with the word itself and say, think about what you're actually doing. You're asking, because in negotiation by definition are circumstances under which you don't have really the power or authority to make another person comply. So they are all asks. The other word that I like is problem solving. So my advisor is the only person I know who's probably has a reputation for being more assertive than I am, and great female role model to me. But she said, I don't negotiate, I just solve problems. And when you think about it like that, right, it's the same thing. You have a problem, I have it. Let me tell you, I got a problem. Can we solve it? I'm not afraid of solving problems. Negotiating I don't really like, but solving problems I could do. So the first thing we have to think about is reframe what's actually occurring in a way that gives us a confidence to actually engage in the conversation. Second thing, planning and preparation. So one thing we need to start to do is to start to figure out what's negotiable and what's not. Because the more confident we are that negotiation is a norm of what is expected to happen, the better we do at it. That a lot of times people will try to suggest, right, and as do we, that things are non-negotiable, right, that there's no movement on anything. But we can ask the questions. And the question of, can I negotiate this, that's never generally goes very well because people will say, well, no, and they could be truthful, like, well, other people do, but no, we don't want you to negotiate this. Questions that really try to get around, okay, what are the parameters here? Are there any circumstances under which outcomes are different? And if I can understand that, then that kind of gives me an opening. So to start to kind of ask those questions. Related to that, to plan and prepare, okay? I guarantee you may or may not like to negotiate, but I am sure you are a good researcher, right? Give you a problem, okay, and you will figure it out, right? Best, you have a sick relative and you need to find the right doctor. Someone has told you that pair of shoes is sold out in your size and by gosh, you're gonna find it somewhere in this country, right? You have a research problem, you're gonna figure out how to get the information that you need to solve your problem. Well, negotiation actually starts, all good negotiation starts with good research about what's a good solution, what's possible. And the psychological research here is that when there is a good understanding of what's negotiable and what's not, when there's a good understanding of what a good goal or target is and what a good kind of bottom line is, when those things are well known, the gender effects also go away. When you take the ambiguity out of the process and the woman is confident, I know what a good deal is and I don't have it and I'm gonna go after something, women do a lot better. And so that's one of the things that we can do is to start doing that research to figure out, are you lacking something that is a reasonable thing to have? And the better prepared we are, the more confident we are to be able to do that. If you're hoping that the other thing that you would learn is that you will end all of these situations without anybody ever saying anything bad about you, you can prepare to be disappointed. But there is best practice and things that we can do. So a couple things, and this is true for any negotiation. One is, what research has shown is that two related points. One is that not all negotiations are about your self-interest. And in fact, this kind of sounds like one that's not solely about you. It's that you are actually negotiating for the benefit of other people and the organization as a whole. The more you highlight that the beneficiary of these, of what you're asking for is not you, that's been shown to help women a lot because there's nothing wrong with women doing that. This is not about me getting what I want, making my life easier. This is about me helping somebody else. So highlighting that piece of it can be useful. Related to that is the idea that anytime research has shown that there's nothing wrong with you enacting the negotiating kind of male-ish stereotype as long as you also are simultaneously enacting the female one as well. And one of the ways that you can combine these is to say things like, here's what I want, and the idea of here's how it benefits other people. Even things that are truly in your self-interest. So if you said, I want to work from home one day a week, or I want to make an adjustment to a schedule, or I want this done at this point, not that point, people might infer a self-interested motive unless you explicitly give them an other interested motive, which is by doing what I what I'm asking for. Here's how it's going to help other people. Here's how I'm going to be more available for my team. Here's how the end product is going to be better, et cetera. So one of the things that you can do is don't assume that the benefits of your request to other people are necessarily evident to the person that you're talking to, and that you might have to go out of your way to highlight those things because you're female in a way that you may not if you were male. So that's one to think about. The other related one of how do you activate the negotiator stereotype and the female one too is to use what people call relational accounts. It's basically saying I'm asking for something, but I'm also demonstrating in some way that I care about the relationship. And anything that you're doing that says, even language like, if the situation were reversed, I'd be doing this for you, or I understand why this is so difficult for you. Things that sound like I'm empathetic, I'm other-oriented, those things have been shown to be uniquely helpful for women. But the basic finding is, and with negotiation, I'll say this, when I talk about things, I always talk about it from a basis of science. What do we know? But when we negotiate, we have science and we have art. And art is the things that come out of your mouth, the things you say and do that actually enable it to work. The science is pretty black and white. There are a million different forms of art that can map onto that science. So the key message that I want to relay to you is that one thing that women have to do is assert their own self-interest and also at the same time communicate to people that I am still other-oriented and concerned about other people as well. Men don't have to worry about that, women do. There's a variety of ways that you could message that, but messaging that and getting that across to your audience will on average be helpful. Will it make all of the backlash you face go away? Maybe not, especially if you're already trying to do it from they've already concluded, right, that you're going to be aggressive and assertiveness and you have to kind of undo it a little bit. It'll take a little bit longer, but that's the main message for everybody, which is combine the two. Okay, figure out a way to be able to do both. Okay, even if it's smiling a lot as you're telling people, no, you're not getting anything that you want, right? There are ways that we can convey that kind of stereotype. So, to my knowledge, there has not been a research finding that says this works with women and it doesn't work with men. Most of the findings are that women punish women as much as men punish women. So there aren't any particular strategies. That said, what do we know in general? We know that similarity is the biggest source of liking and attraction that psychology has ever documented, okay? We like people who like us. Birds of a feather flock together is true. Opposites attract has no empirical support whatsoever. So the advantage that we have when we're negotiating with somebody who is demographically similar to us is that they are similar to us. But it's also true that the similarity doesn't have to be relevant to the conversation to work, and just because it should be obvious to everybody doesn't necessarily mean that it's salient. So when we negotiate, if there are things that unite us, it is always a good idea to draw those things out. He said, if you are a golfer and you ever see a hole-in-one trophy, you know two things absolutely have to be true. There has to be a heck of a story behind the trophy, behind the hole-in-one, and the guy behind the desk is dying to tell you what it is. So he says to him, tell me about your hole-in-one. And they exchange stories. So this story ends in such a cliched way. Let's say they set aside an hour for the meeting. These two guys spend the first 55 minutes talking about golf. By that point, they're friends, okay? So whatever problem and fight they were about to have at the 0-minute mark has now gone away at the 55-minute mark. And they're like, oh, we got 5 minutes. How are we going to solve this? They come up with some resolution and they're on their way. Now, I love that story. And the reason I love that story is not to tell you to talk about golf, okay? And it's not to say that everything is going to end that easily for you. But what was important about that story was that he had a strategy of always going in to try to figure out what unites us. And if something unites us, I'm going to highlight that thing. It does not matter that that has nothing to do with the conversation at hand, because as soon as you realize that you are like me in some way, we are going to get along a little bit better, and that is going to advantage us. And so the fact that you are demographically similar to a woman, I think, does give us a starting point to talk about all kinds of things that make us similar that would be harder to talk about if we were talking about a man. And I would say do that. But it has to be genuine. The other point I make about the story is that I don't talk about golf because I don't really care about golf. And any strategy you ever use is guaranteed to fail you if your audience perceives it as a strategy. So it has to come from a real place, but there's all kinds of things that unite us. So that's one of the things I would say from a research perspective says, let's think about, don't assume that they're obvious. Like, of course you know that we come from the same group or we went to the same school or we did those things. Talk about those things because when those things are salient, they help quite a bit. the interesting thing is the statistics, right, that women are underpaid for the same work relative to men everyone knows them. You didn't come here to hear it from me from the first time. And what researchers have asked is, why aren't women more pissed off about it? And the research is, well, you know what women do? Similarity attraction. People talk to people who are like them. Women talk to other women. So you talk to a bunch of people who have the same circumstances that you, all of whom are also not negotiating things. You're like, I'm doing pretty well, right? Okay? Now, I mean, and when I say I'm assertive, right, I am assertive for all my female colleagues. But I was talking to somebody, and they said that the male colleague of mine was just telling me that every year when we go in for these meetings about how things are going, he comes armed for bear with statistics about how much better he's performing than everybody else in the entire country, okay? Now, I don't know if maybe I would adopt that, maybe I wouldn't, but I'm not doing that. Okay, so the idea is that by talking only to people who are similar to us, who are likely doing the same things we are doing, we get a mistaken sense of what actually is happening out there and what is possible. So one of the things is to network with people who are different from you in a lot of different ways, especially to get this kind of information to say, what are people doing? What are people asking for? And I have found actually a lot of good strategies by watching what my male colleagues is. We know that there is a huge first mover advantage in negotiation. You put the first proposal out on the table, you are much more likely to end that conversation with something that is closer to your desired endpoint than if you're the second mover. There's a huge first mover advantage in negotiation. The person who puts the first proposal about how something's going to be solved on the table, when the final resolution happens, that proposal is going to be advantage the person who made the first offer as opposed to the person who made the second offer. Now, that's a finding that works for everything, okay? It works for houses and cars and salaries, but it works for anything else too. It works for your schedule. So thinking about moving first, but moving first doesn't necessarily mean in a financial transaction. It says put the proposal out there before you're ever to say no to somebody else's proposal, is get ahead of those things and be able to create that dialogue. On average, you'll do better. Not every first offer is accepted in any kind of negotiation, but certainly you'll do better moving first than moving second. As long as you're well prepared for whatever it is, to know what you want. The idea is if you go second, you just want whatever you offer to be as advantageous to you as what their first proposal was to them. But I do hear this a lot from women and from men of, well, you're going to learn something. And there are certainly circumstances, if you are truly unprepared in a negotiation and you don't know what good is, you are in very dangerous water, that you will suggest something that later you will learn is not very good. And you might choose to go second, but if the other person is prepared, they're likely going to put something out that's good for them, and that is only going to make it worse. It's only going to suck you more toward their position, not vice versa. But the basic idea is that the better we understand what we want and what's good for us, the better we are, whether we go first or second, to be able to advocate for. Yeah, so here's the thing. A budget is essentially a reservation point. It is a bottom line beyond which you cannot move. So if you are talking to somebody who is at all savvy about what it is they're doing, they should not in any way let that on, in the same way I would tell you not to let that on, right? If someone says to you, like, what's the least it's going to take for you to work here, I would say don't tell them that, because that's exactly what you're going to get. Yeah. So the budget represents their floor, okay? The worst that they can do before they have to walk away. That's going to be generally closely held information. But I do think if you make an offer, right, the idea is if this is sane and this is crazy, you want your first offer to be right about here, right? Just this side of crazy, okay? If I offer you something that's 20 times more expensive than you were prepared to pay, that's this side of crazy, and no one counteroffers because they're like, we're so far apart. That's what you're worried about, okay? But you also don't want to offer something that's so sane, like, I was prepared to pay 3 times as much, right?
That's what I tend to do sometimes. I'm like, oh, I'm just going to give them the best deal possible.
Right. And so you got to kind of play with this a little bit. But here's what I always say is, if the better are you prepared to know what your aspiration is. If you set your aspiration and your goal in advance of this conversation and not simply try to work off their bottom line, is absent what they want, what do I want? Okay, let me try to push for that. And now, it could be that by pushing for your aspiration, you end up this side of crazy. But it's also the case that what influences whether something is sane or crazy, whether someone counteroffers and stays in the conversation with you, is not just about the number you throw out, but it is also about the justification you give. So if I say to you, like, I don't know what you sell, but like, okay, how about like, $300 a widget, because 300 is my favorite number. Okay, that's not a very compelling justification, even if they're willing to pay 600, okay? But let me tell you 300 because At this volume, that is the lowest price we've ever sold, something like that. Now, it still might be more than they wanted to pay, but now they're like, well, at least I understand why you're asking for what you're asking for. And so how we package the justification ends up being important. So start with your own aspiration. What do we think, right, that this is worth? Let's try that, and let's try to put a justification on that keeps them in the conversation. Because what you actually want in that first conversation is you want a no. You do not want a yes. Because if you say 300, I'm like, sure, right? What's the next thing you think? I went too low. You want a no. You just want an interested no. You don't want the no thank you, we're going elsewhere. Like, we'll never talk to you again. You want the, I don't know if we can do that, okay? And maybe they can't. That gets you a sense of I'm still in the conversation and now I can start asking a few more questions. But the actual item of like, what is their budget? You kind of have to infer it from trying to figure out. And even sometimes the nonverbals, you can tell when you're way out of range because of how people react, and you can tell when you're not. Is try to infer it. And one of the ways I can do it is to try to place the most ambitious first offer I can, justify it as best I can to show them why I'm asking for this and why it's not insane, and then wait to see how they respond to it and to work backward from there. It could be the case that we're going to say, you know what, sometimes people are going to be inconvenienced. It's either going to be me or you, and it might as well be you, okay? And that could be okay. I think basically, I think conscious awareness of what you're doing and the choices can be helpful. For most women, on average, women err too much on the making other people happy and not enough on the own self-interest. So we're talking about, right, I don't necessarily think you have to be him, but you could probably also be, and anybody could be a tick more assertive for their own interest than they are, right? And still have a big gap between that and the person who's completely insensitive to everybody else's needs. So the idea is, I'm gonna give you two choices, okay? The I'm gonna give you two choices strategy works every bit as well at any kind of professional negotiation as it does at home. Now, the idea of the I'm gonna give you two choices is this. The choices are only good choices if you are indifferent as to which one they choose, okay? We can do this or we can do that, doesn't matter to me. But when you give people multiple choices, a couple things happen. One, they trust you more because they say you're not trying to push a particular agenda, you're being collaborative. Now, in fact, you're not being collaborative at all because you're basically just giving two versions of the exact same thing from your perspective, but it seems like it's more collaborative. And the other thing it is it enables people to give their preferences. So one strategy I could use is if I do want to be an advocate for my self-interest, let's use the example of something around schedule, well, I don't have to give one choice, here's 3 times. They're equally convenient for me, but they are different. And therefore, you have some say as well. I'm not saying it has to be 7:30 or nothing. I'm saying it could be 7:30, it could be noon, but it's going to have to wait 2 days, or it could be, on my drive home at 6:30 the day after that, right? And then you have some say. So it's a good strategy for a variety of different things, but it builds relationships while still allowing you to say, pick one, right? And the pick one strategy, people like a lot. It also gives them, it's a way to get a sense of what their preferences are. You can pay attention, you can actually learn what people like. It works just as well in any kind of financial negotiation as well, but I'm gonna give you a few choices. This is what you're talking about is, I am basically a stranger. I am applying for a job kind of at a distance, and on some form, maybe a computer-based form, it says fill in your salary expectations, and I'm trying to figure out how to answer those. And it might have a range of the position or et cetera. Okay, so here's the challenge, right? I do think in any meaningful face-to-face conversation about anything, including compensation, you are advantaged for going first. However, I have talked to recruiter after recruiter, HR person after HR person, and they say, look, they do what everybody else does, and many, raise your hand if you're on this side of it in your organization. We have more resumes than we can know what to do with. We have to have some criteria for getting rid of some of them. If you are out of range, it just makes me think at the end of the day, this won't be successful. I will eliminate you because of that, okay? And so that is a legitimate fear. So I always say if there's any way that you can avoid answering it in that particular stage, when you are just a faceless piece of paper, I do. Many times you can't. It's required to get through the process. I would put in something that to your best knowledge is in range. If you don't even know what's normative for this job, you have some research to do. Back to that idea of research skills before you should even be applying for it. Put in something. I wouldn't sweat it too much at that point, okay? Because you're going to have another opportunity to be able to have that conversation. When I'm face to face with somebody and they ask me in an early stage of salary expectations, I say, look, you can't not give a number because you look evasive. You could try to say, I don't feel like I've learned enough totally about the position to answer that question. And if they drop it, they drop it. If they come back at you, I said, look, if they want to know something, you kind of have to give them a number. But I would hedge it and I would say, look, what I'm interested in here is a job that is going to fully meet my needs and I can make a contribution to. And part of that, whether it meets my needs, is going to be compensation, but part of it's going to be a lot of other variables that we have yet to fully explore. So if you asked me today to give you a number, I would give you a number and I would say X. But I would fully expect that number to go up or down based on some of the other things that we haven't yet talked about. Not only benefits, but what are the responsibilities, what are the opportunities for growth, et cetera. And all of those things could change the number. So as long as you don't mind me telling you tomorrow that my number is different, I'll tell you what my number is today. And it could go in a lot of different directions because you want it to basically say it shouldn't anchor the conversation. And those are a couple of different ideas. But I've heard from person time and time again that a lot of times like no one even sees the application if it's out of range. And we've had that happen a bunch. And that goes to the art piece of it, is there's not just one script that you could say that conveys that, but to say, I have a certain set of expectations, but I'm going to evaluate the entire thing in its entirety, as you absolutely should, because it's not just about one component of it. It's about the total overall value that you would get from it. And so once I see what that is, and if we don't know, if some of those variables are unknown, I feel like I'm making a somewhat uninformed judgment. But if you're asking me, I will make an uninformed judgment because you've asked me. And here's my, judgment as best I understand it right now. And then I would go from there. Once you're to the point where they like you enough, though, that you're having a face-to-face conversation, this risk of being thrown out because you say the wrong thing, it does decrease significantly, right? Because they like you, they're committed to you at this point. Everyone who's gone through recruiting knows recruiting is the biggest pain in the butt, okay? And once I get to a point where I've identified somebody that we want, the last thing I want to do is start over, especially when you work for a state school. Oh my God, the paperwork involved in starting over. I would pretty much give this person whatever they ask for. So when you get to the point where they feel more psychologically committed to you, even if you're just on a short list of candidates, they don't want to lose them all over a couple $1,000s, and next thing you know, they're going to start this whole process over. You're going to have a lot more ability to give an aspirational number and talk about it. And if they don't like it, they might say, you know what, that's never going to be in range for us. And if then you have to decide, do I believe them? Am I going to back off from that and still take that job? If you're in a situation that I haven't confronted before, someone else has confronted this situation before. What did they do? How did it work? And what advice could I take from them that sounds sane enough that I could actually replicate? And so that's what I would say is figure out either at the same people who are doing it at the same time, people who have had it happen to them in your network prior, and say, what did you do, and get that kind of advice as to how to do it, and to use your second and third degree connections. My husband, I'm on LinkedIn too. My LinkedIn is full of nice students who have invited me to be in their LinkedIn, and I pretty much use it as an address book when I need to find somebody. I really underutilize it. My husband actually uses LinkedIn really well. He's in finance, and he often needs to get to a firm that he wants money from, he wants to make an investment in, et cetera. And he is always on there figuring out who, not do I know, but who is 2 and 3 degrees removed that I can call and say, you need to introduce me to this person. He does that all the time in making connections through LinkedIn. So you have to say, it's made it a lot easier for us to do that. We should be doing that, to say, I guarantee you can get to somebody who's going to have some really good advice on whatever situation like that. I have personally never confronted it myself. If I did, I would say, I don't really know what to do here. What's normal? What could I even expect? What's a reasonable aspiration to have when you leave, right? I'd just be making all that up. But if I talk to somebody who's gone through it before, and again, making friends at the peer level, because people like to talk, especially about their successes. You seem like you're really good at doing this. Could you tell me what you've done? Flattery gets you everywhere in life. The psychology on that is very clear with men and with women, right? So I would ask a lot of those questions to see what people have done. So here's the research is that anytime we go to a negotiation and ends in an impasse, whether it's between 2 organizations, 2 human beings, an impasse, meaning we cannot reach an agreement, we have to go our separate ways, it feels really bad, okay? There's a paper on this that looks specifically at this, because the basic phenomenon is escalation of commitment. Once I've escalated my commitment, I've spent time doing this, it feels like nothing else a waste of time to walk away. So it feels like a failure. In fact, when I teach negotiation classes and I have students simulate negotiations, I have to make a specific point to tell them it's okay not to make a deal. Otherwise, they make terrible deals because they think, I'm sitting there, this was all they were going to offer me. That was the best I was going to get, so I'm going to take that. Don't take that deal. That's a bad deal. You walk away from that deal. So impasses feel really bad. And the psychological spiral that happens when people experience an impasse goes like this. We couldn't reach an agreement. That feels really bad. somebody has to be to blame. Well, I can't blame me. It's too ego threatening to do that. So I have to blame you. It's your fault we didn't reach a deal. You didn't come to the table interested in making a deal. You're not cooperative. You're not trustworthy. I have less interest in ever negotiating with you again. Okay, so the fact that you see the bad blood at the end of a negotiation that didn't happen, it could have not happened for very legitimate reasons. Both parties had better alternatives than what either could offer each other. It shouldn't happen. There's no bargaining space there. But that's not how people experience it. People experience it as a psychologically negative event, okay? So you do have to recognize that's very normal, and so you can't, it would be hard to necessarily, you may not be able to undo it, but one thing that could be the case is why did it fall apart, okay? It could be the case that what one person wanted was more than the other person was willing to give, okay? We don't have the overlap. To point that out and say, you know what, it's okay, right? We basically, everybody did what was best for them. Like, we don't fault you for doing what you did, and I don't fault us for doing what we did. It makes a whole lot of sense. And so just to recognize that people have to tell a story, and the story they tell always will put more blame on the other side, in this case is you. And you just have to tell people, you know, to try to work back and say, what you did made sense. Flatter the ego, right? The ego is threatened. You did the right thing. We did the right thing. We're going to figure out another way. Look for some other common ground or similarity. But it's psychologically very, very predictable.
Do groups ever return to try to renegotiate something different down the line?
They do.
Sometimes.
They do. They're less likely, what research shows, to do that than to pick a new partner. But sometimes I need you. I can't go, I'm going to come back because I need to come back. And if I come back, that would be also your real opportunity to say, that's where you would start to try to build that relationship and say, I'm really glad you're back, right? And I think that everything we learned from before is totally going to help us. I'm really excited. I'm like, couldn't be happier to be talking to you again, et cetera. To know that you have a little bit of relationship building to do and to spend the time trying to do that. So there's different kinds of negotiations that we're in. This is going to start like me teaching a lot, but I'll tell you this. Okay, so there's different kinds of negotiations that we're in. We have the what we call the win-lose negotiations. Like, there's $1, only one of us can have it. We're not going to rip it in half. You're either going to get it or I'm going to get it. Okay, and so one of us is going to end up happy with it and the other person's not. Those are negotiations. And then you might say, well, if we could turn the dollar into 4 quarters, you take 50 cents and I take 50 cents, and isn't that better, right? Than you having all of it, I have nothing, and that's a compromise. That's what I'd use to say a compromise. There are other kinds of negotiations that we talk about as win-win, which is there's mutual benefit to be had if only we reframe the problem of what we're asking for, which is, well, Alison, why do you want $1? Right? Like, do you want $1 like because like you have no Kleenex and you're trying to blow your nose in it, or you want to purchase something? Well, what do you want to buy with that $1? You want to buy a candy bar? Oh, I need the $1, but oh, there's a candy bar in my bag that I wasn't going to eat. How about that? Well, okay, that's actually just as good for my purposes. It's introducing something else into the conversation. So in that sense, giving me 50 cents that doesn't allow me to buy a candy bar, and you have 50 cents that doesn't allow you to get whatever you want, is a loss, because it's not as good a solution as figuring out what I wanted. So the cliched story in negotiation is there's an orange and 2 sisters are fighting over it, and they can't figure out what to do, so like, well, you take half and I take half. And only after the fact they recognize that one sister wanted it because she wanted to make orange juice. So only the pulp was useful and the rind was garbage. And the other sister wanted to bake a cake. And so only the rind was useful and the pulp was garbage. And if we talked about that, there was a totally different way to solve that problem that we didn't uncover because we just compromised and split it 50-50. So the only time where I see compromise as a loss is if we just solve the problem that way from the get-go, rather than really explore what does each person really need out of this situation, and is there a way to get them what they need in a different position than what they came to the table asking for. And so here's the research is, look, the computer-mediated, like phone, email, these are not things that are not going away. So it's not like, do I use them? It's just, how do I use them for their maximum benefit? The research on negotiation is this. If you take people who are adversarial, the fewer modes of communication they have to communicate, the better. So email, for example, is actually a really good mode of communication. You would think it's kind of the opposite when people are adversarial. And the reason is if we're face to face, you can not only hear my voice, you can see my eyes, you can see me move, et cetera, okay? So I start to do things and we are having this difficult competitive relationship. Everything I do will be interpreted by you as an aggressive act, right? So I take a step forward, like now I'm trying to come and kill you, okay? Everything I do. More of that we can strip away, research says negotiators do better. When negotiators actually are really cooperative, they have a good relationship, which is why I asked you about your boss. Turns out the medium is actually not predictive at all of how the negotiation ends. It just doesn't really matter. So you don't have to really worry about it. So if you're negotiating a concept of an ongoing relationship that is pretty strong, don't sweat it. Where it's actually really useful to take conversations face to face is where we're kind of in that middle ground of, are you friend or are you foe? I haven't quite figured you out yet. This could go either way. It's been shown that those negotiations actually, the more channels of communication I have to figure that out, the better. And so if I'm in a negotiation, either because of the person or because of the topic, it could become an adversarial conversation or it could become really collaborative. Those are ones that I do think it's worth, if you can, to try to create as many modes of communication as possible. So if you cannot make it face-to-face, at least try to make it like VTC or something like that so that you could do it. But you're gonna have to be judicious because we're not doing everything face-to-face. Like that is not the world that we live in. And when you already have a good relationship, the research shows it doesn't really matter, so email away. But save your face-to-face or your sort of richer communications for those ones where you think this could go really well or it could go really horribly and the jury's still out. Those are the ones where it makes the best impact. So the only thing I'll say is what you're talking about is I don't have a choice, I have to do it over email. There's a great study on egocentrism over email, which is people greatly overestimate how much their intent of a message can be interpreted by their audience, okay? You think that people will be able to decode it with like 80% accuracy and they're not even close. One of the antidotes to that is to have somebody else or to you reread the email and put in intonation that creates the exact opposite intent of what you want. So if you want this email to be angry, read it in a super friendly tone and see what it looks like. If you want the email to be friendly, read it with a super hostile tone and see how it could come across. And then you have to work to edit from there because the research is people are not nearly as good at being able to interpret the intent. So if they're trying to figure out if you're friend or foe, they're horrible at doing it. So if you don't have a choice, the only thing I've ever found in research is that you can't do it yourself because when you reread it in the tone that you would say if you were saying it, so it doesn't work. You have to actually enact the opposite one. So when they had people create messages and then read them deliberately with the opposite intention, they were much better able to realize, oh wait, this won't come across the way I think, and then edit it from there and be able to make changes on it. And so I actually did a paper, I haven't talked much about my own stuff. So one of the first things I ever did when I got in this area was I wrote a paper called The Power of Powerless Speech that basically said that kind of behavior is not nearly as bad as all the popular books that you will find at Barnes & Noble say it is, okay? And the idea is that when we use that, what we call that submissive, powerless language, it is less good for making us come across as assertive and ambitious and confident, but it actually is pretty relationship building in terms of it makes us seem more warm and friendly. And when in situations where those skills are particularly valued, it can be really useful. So here's what I say about it. And then people are like, well, does that mean I should hedge? I'm like, no, it actually doesn't mean that at all. It means that there's a time and a place where what you want to convey is assertiveness, and there's a time and a place where what you want to convey is cooperation. And that all the verbal filler that you have is one and only one way to do that. So I don't really focus people as much on like, should my email say, like, I think it would be nice if, but what I'm trying to convey to you is that we are cooperating. And there's a variety of different ways to do that. And that's actually what's important. And so I don't think you have to micromanage every single sentence as long as you're saying, what's the overall effect I want to have on my audience? And am I generally behaving in a way that's going to have that effect? If I am, full stop. Because that's where the art is, right? I read a bunch of emails. They don't all look the same. Some of them suck. Some of them are brilliant. And all the brilliant ones have differences in them. And so there's ways to be good and be effective and work in a style that works for you. You start to put on something that's too different from you, and it starts to feel like an act. And so even though I am the one who wrote the paper that says that powerless speech is way better than all of those communication books give it credit for, I still say what at the end of the day really matters is what is the overall effect I'm conveying on my audience, and there's still lots of different ways I can do that. All right, I'll stop. Thank you guys. You guys are totally fun. If you have questions, I'm happy to take them after.